The hearing room was already tense, but the moment Zohran Mamdani leaned forward, pointed his finger, and practically spit out the words, "You're a fascist, Senator Kennedy," the entire chamber froze. Staffers stopped typing. Reporters looked up at once. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in instinctively. It was the kind of accusation meant to end a man, not start a real debate. But Kennedy didn't flinch. Not a blink, not a twitch, not a breath out of rhythm. Mamdani expected outrage, denial, maybe a stammered defense. Instead, Kennedy slowly removed his glasses, folded them with calm precision, and placed them on the table as if preparing to teach a class. The room shifted. Everyone sensed something was coming, something big. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his southern drawl quiet but razor sharp. "Son," he said, "when folks like you run out of facts, you start throwing labels like confetti. But confetti don't make a parade. And it sure doesn't make an argument." A few gasps erupted. A staffer covered her mouth. Mamdani's smirk faltered. Kennedy wasn't done. He leaned forward now, voice steady, measured, but carrying enough weight to drop the temperature of the room a full 10 degrees. "You want to talk about democracy?" he continued. "You just tried to shut mine down with one word. That's not courage. That's intellectual bankruptcy." A murmur spread across the chamber. Mamdani, who moments earlier had been brimming with confidence, suddenly looked like someone realizing he'd stepped into the wrong fight with the wrong man. Kennedy clasped his hands. "Now," he said with quiet finality, "if you're done with the name-calling, maybe we can have an adult conversation. I promise I'll go slow so you can keep up." The room exploded. Staffers coughed to hide laughs. A few members openly smiled. Mamdani's face drained of color. And in that single moment, one line, one comeback, Kennedy didn't just flip the exchange. He owned it. Completely. The chamber was already buzzing when Mamdani leaned forward again, his voice sharpened like he'd been waiting hours for this very moment. Cameras shifted toward him, reporters lifted their pens, and the tension snapped tight enough to hum. "Senator Kennedy," he said loudly, performing for the audience rather than addressing the man in front of him, "your rhetoric is dangerous, your positions are oppressive, and frankly, your entire political philosophy reeks of fascism." A few gasps popped through the room, exactly what Mamdani wanted. He sat back with a smug half-smile, believing he'd landed a blow that would ripple across headlines. But Kennedy didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly adjusted his glasses, the gesture calm, controlled, almost amused. The contrast between Mamdani's dramatic flair and Kennedy's quiet composure froze the room. Even the aides standing along the wall looked unsure of what would happen next. Kennedy finally spoke, his voice low enough that people had to lean in, yet firm enough to command the moment. "Son," he drawled, "I've been called plenty of things in my time, but it takes a special kind of confusion for a man who shouts down every opposing view to lecture me about authoritarianism." A ripple moved across the chamber, some stifled laughs, some raised brows. Kennedy didn't stop. "If defending the Constitution makes me a fascist in your book, then maybe the problem isn't my principles. Maybe it's your dictionary." Mamdani's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but Kennedy leaned forward just slightly, seizing the room. "And one more thing," he added, voice carrying now. "Throwing labels around doesn't make you bold. It makes you reckless. And everyone here knows the difference." The chamber erupted, some applause, some shocked murmurs. But the momentum had shifted unmistakably. Mamdani looked like he'd swung for a knockout and missed, while Kennedy sat grounded and unshaken, the clear adult in the exchange. The room tightened the moment Mamdani leaned forward in his chair, his tone sharpening like a blade. "Senator, your entire ideology is rooted in oppression. People like you hide behind law and order while enabling harm. That's why I called you what you are, a fascist. Gasps rippled through the hearing room, aides shifting nervously, reporters lifting their phones, ready to capture the explosion they assumed was coming. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't blink. Instead, he slowly removed his glasses, polishing them with the calmness of a man who had just been handed an opportunity, not an insult. Mamdani pushed again, louder. "Yes, I said it. Fascist. And I won't apologize for telling the truth." Chairs creaked as members turned, waiting for Kennedy to break. But Kennedy simply looked up, eyes steady, expression almost amused. That's when the atmosphere changed. His silence wasn't weakness, it was pressure. It made Mamdani fill the space, keep talking, over-explain, overreach. "Your policies hurt marginalized people," Mamdani added, voice cracking with agitation. Kennedy finally slid his glasses back on, cleared his throat, and the entire room leaned in. Reporters paused mid-keystroke. Even Mamdani froze for a fraction of a second. Kennedy had absorbed the blow, measured the moment, and everyone sensed the counterstrike was coming. The kind that doesn't raise volume, but raises consequences. The chamber grew tense as Zohran Mamdani leaned forward, doubling down on his accusation. His voice sharpened, confidence swelling as if he believed he had finally cornered Senator John Kennedy. "You don't just platform extremist ideas, you enable them," Mamdani declared, stabbing the air with his finger. "That's what fascists do, Senator. They hide behind charm and folksy lines while pushing dangerous agendas." A hush fell across the room, part disbelief, part anticipation. Even staffers froze in place. Everyone knew Mamdani had just crossed a line most lawmakers avoided. The word fascist echoed like a slap across polished marble walls. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply sat back, tapping his pen lightly against the table, studying Mamdani with the patience of a man who had weathered tougher storms and outsmarted tougher opponents. "Son," Kennedy said quietly, his Louisiana drawl smoothing every syllable like slow-poured honey, "I've been called a lot of things in my life. Been criticized by Republicans, Democrats, lobbyists, and folks who don't know the difference between a budget and a biscuit. But this? This is a first." The room leaned in. Kennedy continued, "You toss out that word, fascist, like it's confetti at a parade. But here's the difference between me and someone who actually abuses power. I don't try to silence people who disagree with me. You do." His tone sharpened, revealing the steel beneath the politeness. "You can't defend your point, so you call people names. You can't back up your claim, so you reach for the loudest insult in your pocket and hope it lands." Mamdani stiffened, but Kennedy wasn't done. "If you honestly believe that disagreeing with your far-left fantasies makes me a fascist," Kennedy said, leaning forward now, "then your political vocabulary is smaller than a teaspoon. And your argument? Well, bless your heart, it collapses the moment someone asks you for evidence." Someone in the back snorted. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Even a few members of Mamdani's own caucus pressed their lips together to hide their reactions. Kennedy finished softly, "If you want to debate ideas, son, I'll debate you all day. But if all you've got is name-calling, you're not attacking me, you're advertising your own ignorance." The room erupted, some in laughter, some in stunned whispers, all acknowledging the same thing. Kennedy had flipped the entire exchange in a single, devastating moment. The chamber felt heavier now, not loud, not chaotic, but tense in a way that made every breath feel measured. Mamdani had just tried to frame Kennedy as a fascist, a word meant to sting, to shock, to brand him in front of the cameras. But as the murmurs rippled across the room, it became painfully obvious that the attack had backfired. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't even adjust the papers in front of him. The man was carved out of Louisiana granite. And Mamdani? He suddenly looked like someone who realized he had walked into the wrong fight with the wrong man. Kennedy leaned back slightly, not arrogantly, but thoughtfully, as if he were taking a moment to allow Mamdani's word to echo, and die. Then he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk with the calm of someone who had been insulted by professionals, not amateurs. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, almost disarmingly polite. "Representative," he said, "where I come from, when someone doesn't have a real argument, they start throwing labels around like Mardi Gras beads." A few people chuckled, quietly at first. Mamdani stiffened. Kennedy continued, never raising his voice, never rushing, letting every syllable land exactly where he wanted it. "But let's be clear about something. Words like that, fascist, those aren't debate points. They're panic buttons. They're what you press when you're losing." The chuckles grew louder, the tension shifting like a tide moving decisively to Kennedy's side. Mamdani tried to interrupt, twice. But Kennedy simply lifted a hand, politely but decisively. "No, son. You had your swing. Let me have mine." The room froze. Even the reporters lowered their cameras an inch, sensing something sharp about to cut through the air. Kennedy locked eyes with him. If defending the Constitution, respecting the rule of law, and refusing to shout slogans instead of facts makes me a fascist in your world, then maybe the problem isn't my vocabulary. Maybe it's yours. A wave of reactions swept through the chamber, whispers, a few gasps, even scattered applause. Mamdani's confidence drained from his face like someone had pulled the plug. Kennedy had flipped the entire exchange with one calm, precise blow. The chamber went silent, not out of respect for Mamdani, but because every person in the room felt the shift in power the moment Kennedy straightened his posture. His calm wasn't the calm of surrender. It was the calm of a man who had been through bigger storms than a grandstanding assemblyman desperate for a viral clip. Kennedy placed both hands on the table, leaned forward just enough to reclaim the space Mamdani had tried to dominate, and spoke in a slow, deliberate tone that carried more force than any shout. "Son," he said, letting the single syllable cut through the tension like a blade, "you don't get to call someone a fascist just because you ran out of facts. That's not courage. That's panic." A low stir rolled through the room. Mamdani blinked, taken aback. He clearly hadn't expected Kennedy to fire back with composure instead of anger. But Kennedy wasn't done. He continued, his Louisiana drawl measured, steady, undeniably authoritative. "You've spent 5 minutes yelling instead of proving a single thing you just claimed," Kennedy said, raising a finger. Not one shred of evidence. You don't fight tyranny by throwing around big words you found on Twitter. You fight tyranny with truth. With principles. And with enough backbone to debate without hiding behind insults. Reporters shifted forward, sensing the moment. Even Mamdani's own allies stopped nodding and started watching, uncertain, bracing. Kennedy leaned back, but his voice grew firmer. "Let me tell you what fascism actually is," he continued. "It's when people in power think they can silence others by labeling them, shaming them, or screaming over them. And based on what I've seen today, son," he gestured toward Mamdani with a calm, unshakable certainty, "you're a lot closer to that definition than I'll ever be." A gasp rippled across the chamber. Mamdani's face tightened, his confidence evaporating in real time. Kennedy had dismantled his entire attack without raising his voice, without theatrics, just precision, truth, and the kind of rhetorical discipline Mamdani had no answer for. Kennedy folded his notes closed with a soft thap, sealing the moment. "Now," he said, pausing long enough for the room to hang on his final words, "if you'd like to actually talk policy, I'm right here. But if all you've got are insults, I'd suggest you try them on someone who scares easier." The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in something Mamdani had desperately hoped would never happen. Applause. The hearing room had gone silent after Kennedy's last line, but Zohran Mamdani wasn't finished embarrassing himself. His face flushed red, jaw tight, yet instead of regrouping, he lunged forward verbally, like a man who had already lost but refused to accept it. "You're dodging," he snapped, waving a stack of papers that weren't even relevant to the topic anymore. "You can't defend your record, so you hide behind jokes and folksy lines." Every eye in the room shifted to Kennedy. They knew that tone. They'd seen that posture. Mamdani was spiraling, and Kennedy wasn't even breaking a sweat. The senator leaned back in his chair, fingers laced calmly, like a professor waiting for a student to realize the answer had been wrong the entire time. "Mr. Mamdani," Kennedy said, his voice low and steady, "if confidence alone made something true, you'd be the most correct man alive." A quiet ripple of laughter rolled through staffers behind him. Mamdani stiffened, clearly thrown, but Kennedy wasn't done. "But we don't govern based on volume. We govern based on facts. Something you might want to try reading instead of waving." Mamdani slapped the stack on the table, but the sound only made him look more unhinged. "You twist everything. You're dangerous," he blurted out, no longer measured, no longer strategic. It was emotional, frantic. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. Instead, he turned slightly, addressing the entire room, not Mamdani. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, when someone runs out of facts, they start throwing labels. They shout fascist, dangerous, evil, because those words are easier than explanations." He paused, just long enough for the moment to crystallize. "And when all you've got left is name-calling, that means you've already lost the argument." A wave of reactions swept the room. Soft chuckles, impressed nods, a few whispered, "He's right." Mamdani looked stunned, like he'd walked into a punch he never saw coming. Kennedy had shifted the energy entirely, flipping the exchange once again with pure composure. He didn't humiliate Mamdani with anger. He did it with clarity. And everybody in that chamber knew it. The room felt heavier than before, as if every pair of eyes in the chamber sensed the moment had shifted. Zohran Mamdani, who only minutes earlier had leaned forward with the smug confidence of someone certain he had the moral high ground, now sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Kennedy and the crowd as murmurs rippled across the hall. But Senator John Kennedy wasn't finished. Not even close. Kennedy rested both hands on the table, not slamming them, not raising his voice. Just claiming the space with the calm authority of a man who had weathered far greater storms than a freshman representative's attempted humiliation. His southern drawl cut through the tension like a clean blade. "Congressman, you keep confusing loud opinions with moral wisdom. Those two things ain't the same, never have been, and after tonight, everybody here knows it." A few staffers tried, and failed, to hide their smirks. Even members who typically sided with Mamdani shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unwilling to attach themselves to the crumbling argument he'd built. Mamdani straightened the stack of papers in front of him, but his hands trembled just enough for the cameras to catch it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing too late that anything he said now would look like scrambling, not strength. Kennedy continued, leaning back just slightly, eyes locked on Mamdani with a mixture of restraint and razor-sharp clarity. "You threw around a word you thought would stick. You hoped it'd land like a punch. But son, you don't fight with truth by using labels you don't understand. You fight with facts. And tonight, you brought none." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it crackled. A few members exchanged glances. Others nodded, subtly, as if acknowledging that the senator had just taken complete command of the moment. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply presented reality with the force of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Mamdani swallowed hard, shoulders sinking as the weight of his failed attack settled over him. The bravado was gone. The certainty was gone. All that remained was the unmistakable truth that he had walked into an exchange he wasn't prepared for. And Kennedy had flipped it without breaking a sweat. The chamber was so quiet it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Zohran Mamdani, who minutes earlier had hurled the word fascist like it was a clever punchline, now sat rigid in his chair. The confidence that carried him into the confrontation had evaporated the moment Senator John Kennedy flipped the exchange on its head. And now Mamdani was trapped in the aftermath of his own miscalculation. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk, as if he were talking to a student who'd wandered into class without doing the reading. "Congressman," he said, his calm Louisiana cadence slicing through the tension, "around here, if you want to debate ideas, you bring facts. If you want to label people, you bring insecurity. And I'm seeing a whole lot of the second." A few staffers shifted, trying, and failing, to hide smirks. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every beat of Mamdani's stunned expression. He opened his mouth to respond, but Kennedy gently raised a hand. "No, son. You had your turn. And you used it to call me the kind of thing your history textbooks warned you not to throw around lightly." The room vibrated with a low hum, half disbelief, half admiration. Kennedy continued, each word measured, unshakable. "You don't call someone a fascist for disagreeing with you. You call someone a fascist when you don't have the backbone to defend your own argument." Mamdani blinked hard, the color draining from his face. His earlier swagger had collapsed into something borderline timid. Kennedy didn't press the advantage cruelly, he simply laid out the truth with the precision of a surgeon. "I respect your passion," he said. "But passion without discipline is just noise. And son, you made a lot of noise today." A ripple of applause started from the back row. One person, then three, then the entire side of the chamber aligned with Kennedy's reasoning. Even a few who rarely agreed with him couldn't suppress the clap. The sound filled the room like a verdict being delivered. Mamdani looked down at his papers, as if hoping they'd swallow him whole. Kennedy leaned back, calm as ever, the storm he'd just navigated settling around him like a crown. "Next time," he added quietly, "try debating instead of detonating." The applause grew louder. Kennedy didn't need to stand. He had already won the room had fallen into an electric, uneasy silence, one that Zohran Mamdani clearly didn't know how to handle. His earlier outburst, the reckless, "You're a fascist, Kennedy," still hung in the air like smoke after a cheap firework. Staffers shifted uncomfortably, cameras zoomed in, and every member of the committee watched the two men as if the entire session had funneled itself into this single moment of reckoning. Mamdani tried to regain his footing, straightening his papers, lifting his chin as if indignation alone could rewrite reality. But the damage was already done. He had swung wildly, emotionally, without evidence, and Kennedy never let a wild punch land twice. Senator John Kennedy leaned back in his chair, a calm, measured confidence settling over him like armor. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need theatrics. All he needed was clarity, and he had it in abundance. "Representative," Kennedy said, his tone cool as glass but sharp enough to cut, "where I come from, when someone loses the argument, they start throwing names. And son, you're throwing names like you're scared of the truth you don't want to face." A few stifled laughs broke out. Staffers glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. Even a couple of members on Mamdani's side hid reluctant smirks behind their hands. The shift had begun. Mamdani opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The fire was gone. Kennedy didn't stop there. "You accuse me of fascism," he continued, "yet the only person here demanding that people shut up is you. The only person trying to bully his way through a discussion is you. And the only person who thinks yelling counts as evidence is, again, you." This time the reaction wasn't muffled. A ripple of applause traveled across the room. Cameras caught it, microphones picked it up, and Mamdani visibly shrank under the sound. Kennedy leaned forward, delivering the final blow with a voice steady enough to echo. "If you want to debate policy, I'm here. If you want to debate facts, I'm here. But if all you've got is calling people names, you're in the wrong hearing. The applause grew louder, confident, enthusiastic, undeniable. Mamdani sat frozen, swallowed whole by the moment. Kennedy hadn't just defended himself. He had flipped the entire exchange, exposing the weakness behind the insult and reclaiming total control of the room. And everyone watching knew it. Senator John Kennedy stepped forward, calm, steady, and totally unshaken by the chaos Mamdani had tried to unleash. After a long moment, he looked around the chamber, at the stunned lawmakers, the silent staffers, the cameras frozen in disbelief, and spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had already won the argument miles ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kennedy began, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharpened blade, "when someone tries to label you with a word they barely understand, that's not an argument. That's a panic button." He paused, letting the weight of that line settle. "I don't shout people down. I don't hide behind slogans. I deal in facts. And when the facts scare somebody so much that they resort to name-calling, well, that tells you who's standing on solid ground, and who's just sinking." A ripple of approval moved across the chamber. Kennedy nodded once, finishing with the simple power that always defined him. "You can attack my accent, my tone, my style. But you will never rewrite my principles. And if defending common sense makes someone uncomfortable, then maybe they should rethink their own." The room erupted, applause rising like a wave as Mamdani sat frozen, realizing the moment had slipped away from him forever.